one of the most famous buildings in India, and it's also one of the most famous buildings in the world. Many people call it the most romantic hotel in the world. And rather than just using it as a slogan for advertising, I would actually like to look at this idea of romance, of enchantment, and of pleasure by looking at the history of lake palaces. Because while this is a unique property, it's also part of a typology of architecture that is unique to India. Of course, buildings and water, this is a unity that exists all over the world, but in India, it is a specific case that we'll have a brief look at. So here again, I think it's this beautiful image of the lake palace, which is like a floating palace in the middle of the water, where the water functions as a mirror, where the white color of the building is accentuated by the sun and by the water. Of course, there are many other lake palaces. Whenever I talk to my students or people about lake palaces, only one property comes to mind, which is Jagnivar's Lake Palace in Udaipur. But there are many other lake palaces. So far, I've gathered over 25 lake palaces. And I distinguish between two types, the island lake palace and the lake palace overlooking the lake at the shore, sometimes on a hill. The interesting thing is that all of these lake palaces are generally in desert areas. And this comes as a surprise. How can you have such a big and generous lake, so much water in the middle of the desert? And the answer, of course, is it's an artificial, man-made, constructed lake, which functions as a reservoir. And this is unique to India. So here, for instance, we see the Jal Mahal Palace in Jaipur, Kota, and Naga Lake Palace, and Dungapur Lake Palace. So I'd like to take you a little bit through the history and evolution of this particular type of architecture. Here, for instance, we see the lake palace in Bundi. Bundi is very well known, and the lake palace, the wall paintings are unique. And I've showed this particular picture, which is actually not in the lake palace, but in the fort, because the color scheme really reflects on the idea of water, on the green and the blue aspect of water. Sometimes, of course, water can have a very utilitarian function. For instance, the blue color made of indigo was also believed to repel mosquitoes and insects. So apart from the kind of spiritual aspect and the aesthetic aspect, you could also have very basic aspects such as that. Here in this case, the lake is covered with lotus, and you don't have this kind of mirror effect, but if you can see the building is very similar to the island palace, also giving you this idea that it is floating. And of course, the image changes depending on the season and the height of the water level. So let me just get rid of these. So I would like to accentuate these two important parts. So on the one hand, the island palace that evokes the image of a floating palace where the lake becomes a mirror, and then a palace overlooking the lake. And the themes I'd like to focus on and keep in mind while we are talking is the lake as a reservoir, the lake as a fortification and to give security, the lake and pleasure, and the lake to give relief from the heat, and the lake and water is spirituality. So I see a similarity and parallel with the development in Europe from fortified buildings to pleasure buildings, particularly what is called the Maison de Plaisance or the Lustgarten in German. This is particularly associated with this important book here, Distribution des maisons de plaisance et de la décoration des édifices en général by François Blondel. Although this is dealing with the 18th century and with a particularly famous example of Sans Souci, the Palace Without Sorrow of Frederick the Great, and we also have the earlier development of the Garden Palace in Austria, for instance, by Fischer von Erlach, which you see here. And interestingly, this developed in the 17th century after the siege of Vienna. So after the threat of the Turkish kind of conquest was gone, you have this, an abundance of these garden palaces. I also wanted to accentuate architecture of the time, at the time that Udaipur was established. So on the one hand, we have the Taj Mahal and the unique whiteness and the purity and the symbol of love of the Taj Mahal. On the other hand, we have the Chateau De Versailles, built in 1631, but of course, the important phase was really with Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the architect Louis Le Vau, together with the landscape architect and the painter in the second part of the 17th century. And this was, of course, the important aspect and impact on any kind of palaces, not only in Europe, but also in India. We know that some Indians were sent, for instance, to France and to Versailles when Louis XVI was king. In India, we have already something like a lake palace in the 15th century in Mandu, and this was also referred to as a ship. And the architecture is, the color is different because it is the red sandstone, but it was already associated with the pleasure palace with, thousands of women, music, dance. So the idea of pleasure and the lake palace is old and already started there. And we also have a manuscript from the time with recipe, and this is now at the British Library, the Book of Delights, recipes from very normal things such as boiling vegetables to aphrodisiacs and beautiful recipes. Here we have Chittor, which is also very closely associated with the royal family of Mewar. And here what we see is already a small lake palace. Although this is a 19th century addition, we know that there was a lake palace. So the idea again of pleasure and also being secure of the famous queen and so on is associated with this building. Here I'm showing you the magnificent fort, a little bit bigger so you can get a sense of it. And here we have the transition period in the 17th century from fortified architecture to pleasure palaces. This, for instance, is the Balsa Lake Palace near Jodhpur, and this is the type where you have it, the lake palace on the shores overlooking the lake and with the red sandstone. Here's an early example from the lake functioning more like a moat from Germany, Castle Mestelbrunn, where the moat was also used to keep fish, for instance, and to keep enemies out and to keep the family safe. In the 18th century, we have examples here of Alva, and here on the left, you see the palace actually overlooking the water tank. So clearly this is a combination of tank, stepwell, and the utilitarian function and harvesting of water and the necessity and importance of water in combination with the architecture. A fascinating, example.
Around 11 minutes are up, so.
Thanks. Yes, I'm soon coming to the end, is Deepwater Palace, which also already starts this kind of typology that I mentioned. It looks like a floating palace, and it has this illusion of the floating. We have it in the 19th century as well, and we have also a lake palace in the 20th century with the biggest lake palace of all of them in Agartala, which clearly kind of is a revivalist style reminding of Udaipur. So here I'm concluding my presentation and just show you a little map of Udaipur with the various lakes and the complex water structure of these artificial lakes associated with the lake palace. So now we continue with Dipti, who will give us a background of the art history and the depiction of the lake palace in paintings at the time, with a focus on the 18th century. Dipti, you are still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, thank you for this introduction and for the opportunity to present at the Center for Historic House of India, the Jindal School of Architecture. I hope there'll be an opportunity to learn more once we can escape these Zoomified worlds. Nonetheless, I hope that we can inhabit another world where we can think about how much of intellectual and creative innovations across mediums in architecture, design of water pool systems, painting, poetry, politics, really center and stem around and are shaped by the Jagnivas Lake Palace in the 18th century, which will be my focus. So I'll just share my screen to get my presentation up there. I'll probably go over some parts quickly, given that, Mimi has given us this introduction to lake palaces in general, but, I'll nonetheless be going between architecture, painting, poetry, lakes, infrastructure, and so on. So Udaipur, as you see in this view over here, was established as the capital of the Mewar court around 1559. It really registers as an oasis within the dry desert landscape of Rajasthan. And in many of the photographs, as you saw, at the center of this oasis is really the Jagnivas Lake Palace, today the Taj Lake Palace Hotel, where visitors, of course, arrive in motorized boats to this historic site. Nonetheless, each time I take that journey, the way one goes through that, one experiences the breeze, the way one sees the sun glisten over the waves of the lake, you're kind of transported back to a time period that would have been the experience even when you were in very different boats, where you were moving much calmly as the cool breezes took you closer and closer to the lake palace. And it's also, fairly dramatic. As you're getting closer to it, you start seeing, that white architecture shimmering. You start seeing some of those colored glasses that are there in the palaces that shimmer in this light as well. And then once you are inside, in a way, and in what I'll be showing you today, you're in a world that's created of its own, a world of pleasure, which, keeps you inside in a way, but you're constantly, in a way, reminded of the presence of the lake waters around you, with the breeze that brings in the moisture, with the breeze that slowly kind of circulates that floral scent and that humidity. Even, today when you have more divisions that a hotel would require, nonetheless, there are these favorite spots that I have within the Lake Palace where you can actually feel the breeze going from one corner of the building to the other, passing through it. And it's these kind of sensorial experiences that I've taken as the cue for my research. And it's through keeping some of these experiences in mind that I want to offer you a glimpse into the historical kind of mediations of these sensual, sensorial pleasures of the Jagnivas Lake Palace, and how we'll see painting and poetry, the architecture and the setting of the lake, the political networks and personal friendships, how they come and coalesce in the Jagnivas, and how you have these very powerfully locally charged imaginings that become part of the Jagnivas, and in kind of presenting it as this exceptional lake palace of its time, where poets and painters really invite their audiences to very deeply experience the pleasures that the lake palace and the city of Udaipur offered, but also to realize, maybe for us to realize, more than the historical connoisseurs, the power of that kind of pleasure, right? What it exercised on its communities. To understand the Lake Palace thus far, scholars have turned to two kind of sources. One is they've often gone to the accounts of James Todd, the first British colonial agent who was based in Udaipur, and to the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, where you get the descriptions of these lake palaces and their kind of sensual materiality, as you see in this quote up on the screen. And the second archive are these mid-18th century Udaipur court paintings, where you get to know the interior worlds of the lake palace. So for example, in this painting, which is made by the artists Sukha and Sayaji, we see Maharana Jagat Singh II, enjoying a performance of music and dance with his companions that are there. He enjoys this performance of the Krishna's Ras Leela that is there. He enjoys the various gardens that are there. And in enjoying these various kind of sensorial pleasures that please the sight, their sounds, their, the smells of the kind of perfumes that were there in the air, it's all of this that in a way comes together in how the scribe, the court historian, in a way, of the court of Udaipur inscribes the painting on the back. He describes it as a pano of the Surat, a picture of the likeness of Maharana Adhiraj, Maharana Jagat Singh, and Jagnivasro Bhav, the mood or the feeling of Jagnivas, the mood of pleasure at Jagnivas. It kind of captures everything in this pithy inscription. Then scholars have often looked at these two sources together. Often architecture historians have used such paintings as documentary evidence to see how and where they match up to the building today, these depictions. Painting historians have often used, Todd's descriptions to describe what we see in these paintings today. Both of them are slightly anachronistic methods because in a way they are not really taking into account the genre of these paintings itself, which tie up actually a lot more to genres of pleasure and writings on pleasure that are in circulation at this time. In the case of Udaipur, we have actually a very, very specific source. A third source, which I draw upon a lot, which has not been translated, which has not been used much in scholarship until now. And this is the 18th century poetry of Jag Vilas, written by the court poet Mandaram in Braj Bhasha, that's in classical Hindi. It's a 405 verses long poetry that commemorates the 3-day inauguration ceremony and celebration of the inauguration party, which started on 20th January 1746. So it's a poem like none other, which really brings this place into, brings a lot of light to this place in all of its glory when you have this entire excitement around its inauguration. In this poetry, we have everything from when the king Maharana Jagat Singh gave the orders for this lake palace to be built. We have praise of the king himself, and in various kinds of in modes that were established in classical literature. We have a Nagar Varnan, which translates as, a kind of an emotive description of beautiful cities and plentiful settings that combine the real place of Udaipur, and it also idealizes Udaipur as no other place on earth, often comparing it to Shiva's dhams, right, to Mount Kailash and so on. But we also get details on this entire inauguration of the kinds of gifts that were given, the ceremonies that took place, who was present. how you actually see that the poet uses these very specific water metaphors to describe any historical circumstances. That the pace of giving of the gifts by Maharana Jagat Singh was like the pace at which the water flows, right? That the water never ends in Lake Pichola, and the gifts that he keeps on giving never ends in a way. So if we take all of these various ideas that are discussed in these 400 odd verses, we actually start interpreting Jag Vilas, the name of the poem, as either say the pleasures of Jagat Singh, the Vilas of Jagat Singh, or the pleasures of Jagnivas Palace, or almost as Jag of Vilas, world of pleasure, right? And Jagnivas as the world of pleasure. And once we enter into this kind of a framing, it really enables us to look at the paintings and the poetry and the architecture through almost new eyes, through a more historicized framework, if you will. And it's important to think about the political scenario, right? So if we're talking of this time period, from especially the early 18th century onwards, you have a shifting political landscape with, with the Mughal Empire that's not as strong, that's disintegrating. There are new alliances between the kings of Udaipur, Amber, later on Jaipur and Jodhpur, who are having their own diplomatic and marital alliances that are coming into place. And at this time, the Udaipur kings, in a way, are more dependent or are more interested in their ties with the local elites and the estate holders who populated their daily courts, the Thakurs of Mewar. And in this kind of a political climate, then Jagnivas becomes this kind of a captivating space that integrates these pleasures and the politics of diplomacy, right? The best politicking then and now always takes place in parties, as we all know. And Jagnivas was that ultimate party place for that performance to take place. I'll skip over the next section where I was placing Jagnivas within a larger trajectory of lake palaces, since Mimi has covered some of this and since I've published this in a couple of my articles. So I'm happy to talk more about this once we get to the discussion part. One thing I do want to emphasize, which may be evident and many may know, but is worth remembering, that the siting of Udaipur and the creation of man-made lakes was central to the founding of Udaipur, right? So here I have again a part of a scroll, a painted scroll on the genealogical history of the Mewar kings from circa 1732. And the section that I'm showing you over here shows the conception of the palace of Udaipur. And you can see how these various channels are feeding into these lakes, and that is something which is really emphasized by the artist. You have Maharana Uday Singh featured over here, who established Udaipur, and we have an inscription over here which actually says that the Udaipur has been settled, right? And this settling is taking place around lakes where life is flourishing. This kind of decision that around which lake life would flourish was also something that was given a lot of thought, something that we have a lot of information on within literary sources, right? So this question of appreciation of lakes as an important source of water, as the space which offers the site for the ultimate pleasurable experience, and as spaces that were then celebrated both in terms of the real environs and paintings. This painting of Udaipur, which is in the City Palace Museum in Udaipur itself. But even before this shift took place in the 18th century, early 18th century, which I address in my forthcoming book, you have this kind of celebration in Udaipur paintings of lakes as idealized aesthetic spaces and as spaces where which made a certain kind of life possible, right? So here you have a painting where you have idealized lakes depicted with the onslaught of the monsoon, you know, depicting most likely a poet talking to, you know, narrating to Radha, reciting to Radha poetry that was about love and longing for her beloved who's not around her during the monsoon. But what's interesting for us to see is that along with the rains, along with the birds, along with these streaks of lightning, we see these ideal lakes with the lotuses blooming, right? Something which we may not encounter in Lake Pichola today, but something that was central to it in the 18th century, both in how it was experienced, but also how it was depicted, how it was imagined as this ideal lake, an ideal place, right? So with this, and yeah.
Around 15 minutes have passed, so if you
Okay.
could wrap up, it's not an issue. Yeah.
Okay, can you give me 5 minutes?
Yes, Dipti, it's fascinating.
Yes,
Please go on.
Okay. Okay. So with that, like, let us enter into this world of pleasure at Jagnivas that I've laid out for you. This kind of entering into the world of Jagnivas is something that's really heightened in Nandaram's poetry as well, where there's this anticipation that is built up that now we are going to get to the party inside. It's going to be inaugurated now. Like, what is it going to be like? And I think this one painting really captures that. This is in the Museum Riedberg. It's in the Riedberg Museum in Zurich, where you see Jagat Singh II arriving at Jagnivas, and you know that he's arriving because on the terrace you can see that this throne has been prepared for him. You have this pavilion, kind of almost like an arrow, pointing us towards this, that he will come, he will be here, and then this will be transformed, this place will be transformed into Jagvilas, the world of pleasure, right? There are these other, we have 5 known paintings of Jagat Singh, the patron of Jagnivas, of him enjoying Jagnivas. I'm sure there were others made. These are the 5 that we know of today. And 3 of them that are there really focus on the interiority of the Lake Palace. And the interiority of the Lake Palace, one space at a time. And I think that's something really interesting, and that is something that I want to highlight, right? So for example, in the painting on the right, you can see that he's again enjoying, he's arriving at his throne, and he's enjoying music, and you know, he's enjoying music with his companions who are there. On the left, you of course are seeing the most famous space of the Jagnivas, which is today known as the Lily Pool, known as the Bado Mahal, and the Dilaram courtyard. In its time, that is a courtyard that gave that besotted the heart the most, right? And this is the courtyard that is often depicted in paintings. This is the courtyard that is described first in detail in Nandaram's poetry. And you can see over here how the crafted forms of that central tank, which is made out of this abstract lotus design, is something that's praised a lot in how it brings everyone together. If we look at it along with this painting that I'll return to, you can see how the king is at the center, and you have all of those forms surrounding him in the way the painter has designed the painting, which animates his portrait, right? Which almost kind of juxtaposes the interior of the space and the king at the center of that interior space, if you will. Another painting which is about interiority and another courtyard at the corner of the Jagnivas Lake Palace, we can see in a way social aspects of this interiority and the kind of intimacy that could be established when you have these nobles and kings who are enjoying the pools together, right? You can swimming and, you know, dipping their bodies and getting away from the summer heat. But you also see all of the people who are cooking and who are bringing water and who are making this world of pleasure possible. The labor that goes into the world of pleasure, which I'm sure, you know, the current, all of the staff that keeps the Lake Palace running today would highlight that first, if you will, right? And here you can almost see in this painting the kind of relaxation, the kind of you know, the way in which you're not seeing people necessarily in very formal poses, right? And that again gives you a sense of that in this world of pleasure, away from everything else, the kind of intimacy and the kind of conversations and friendships, the kind of politics, the kind of bonding, almost the joys of bonding and what that enabled is what is depicted over here, right? And with this joy, something that I won't go into detail, you know, won't go into in detail here, but I would like to tell you is that in the Jagvilas poetry, we actually have a sequence of almost 22 verses, which are specifically on the question of sukh, of joy. And they end with that when the king, when Jagat Singh arrives in Jagnivas, he rules with joy. Sukso Rajat Ran, right? He comes there and finds the ocean of joy. So you find first all of these various metaphors for joy that are used in the form of water, ocean, rain clouds that are bursting and, you know, making their appearance within this palace. And then you see this kind of you see this description of political rule that happens through pleasure, through joy, right? And this is the sense I'm trying to give you in looking at this material together, which also emerges only when you look at this material together, right? And the last concluding point that I want to make then is by actually returning to Bado Mahal and returning to this lily pool and returning to architecture, right? So if the painting, the architecture, the poetry really brings out the atmospheric and the environmental medium of water, and the city of Udaipur brings that out, that how critical that was to the inception of lake palaces, what we see is that the craftsmen who designed this place also engage very intimately the material and sensorial qualities of water in how they design this space, right? So if you look at this entire Bado Mahal, you can see that what the craftsman has really done is that he's tried to make that vision of lotus-filled lakes permanent in the interior of the Jagnivas, right? So you have this entire design of the courtyard done in such a way that you're seeing these broad petals and bases of the leaves that would be spread out on a lake from which your lotuses would rise, right? And that is used as the mode to design this space, just like, in fact, this is a photograph from the Sukh Sagar that in Bundi that you saw the photograph in the earlier presentation as well. And this is the kind of design that you have the craftsmen going after, these broad leaves and the lotus rising from that. And if in a way this painting captures it the best, that you have these stalks of the leaves that are splayed around here, and your lotuses would actually be rising within this water, or you can think of the king itself being praised as a lotus over here. And you can then think of how this lotus-themed pool is seen as the center in the paintings, in the architecture, in the poetry to seduce the connoisseurs. You can think of it as also, you know, in the seasons when there wasn't enough rain. But you have here inside Jagnivas the vision of lotus-filled lakes that is there. And this anecdote that is there, or rather these entries that are there from later court records from the 19th century, from early 19th century, from Maharana Bhim Singh's time, which are there in the archives of the City Palace Museum, you in fact find entries where Maharana Bhim Singh arrives in Jagnivas and he asks for the fountains to let the water into this specific courtyard for him to enjoy it, for him to be able to feel cool, to be soothed. I haven't yet got to the research to see whether when he asked for those during a summer day, during a monsoon season, during a spring season, we have multiple entries, that what was that the situation of the monsoon at that time. Nonetheless, you get a sense that the architects in their design are really kind of engaging very deeply the question of metaphor, the question of signification, the question of the role that water plays in not just becoming the site of lake palaces, but in some ways, lake palaces becoming the frame from where you look on to beautiful lakes. So I'll end over there.
Dipti, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. You really brought this building to life with your research, your study of the paintings, which is absolutely unique. I'm sure everyone is really thrilled to hear this. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask Prince Lakshyaraj to comment and present from the first-hand account of the family. And of course, the question I have is, when you have such a legacy of the family with everything that has been achieved and done, how can you fill this spot, as a just, a normal human being in a way in this day and age? How do you deal with this legacy? And what do you think, what kind of contribution do you intend to make and have made and hope to continue to make in the future?
Presentation. Great. There's a small video first, just for a couple of minutes, and first and foremost, good evening and good morning to everybody from all the other parts of the world as well. So there's a small video which I would like to share and then perhaps get into the question. Greetings, good evening, everyone. First and foremost, very much for the. Sorry. Well, thank you, everyone, and a very good evening, and for having me on the program. I think there are far more learned and qualified people about Mewar and Udaipur present on this panel. It does, make me a little bit more nervous when I'm there in front of all these people who know your history, your place, your city, your home a lot better than yourself. So it's really fascinating to be able to share the stage with everyone. So thank you once again. I'm really humbled to be amongst this wonderful gathering. But to be able to share things from a perspective of home, when you mentioned that question, Professor, when you asked that question, the first thing that I personally feel that it is nature that has worked with you. You know, I think everybody is privileged and honored to be on this planet in the form that they are, and especially mankind. I think we really and truly must be privileged in terms of what we have done to take shape, to take form, to come to Mother Earth as humans. And I think that itself is a huge blessing. Now, the cards that you've been dealt with, the responsibility that you've been given in any space or shape or any part of the country or any part of the world that you may have been born is something that is obviously not in your control. So being born where I was born, I'm eternally grateful. I'm privileged, I'm humbled. A lot of people do ask me at the same time that, do I see this as a burden? Do I see this as a problem? I certainly would say that it is certainly a beautiful challenge that is there in front of you. Now, how you decide to take this forward, how you deal with how do you already deal or work with the cards that have been dealt to you is, I think, what is going to determine success. And Mewar, for all these 76 generations up to my father, what I personally believe is a philosophy or a mantra that we have followed in a layman's language and not as an academic, and I'm not going to go down that route or even attempt to go down that route. But as a person from the family, as a person who's been living and breathing these spaces day in and day out, somebody who's been very curious and been looking over his dad's shoulder to see how things have been functioning, how things have been unfolding. The one thing that stared me in the eye very, very clearly is something that we have been firm believers of, the fact that the idea has never been to go through life. The idea has always been to grow through life. So for all these 1500 years, the progress, the thought process, the ideology, may it be in terms of art, culture, tradition, building, poetry, any subject that we may wish to take up, the idea has just never been to go there and tick those boxes because they needed to be done. But the fact of the matter is that there needed to be growth, there needed to be an extension, there needed to be things that needed to be done in the rightful manner in the era that what was required. Even if Mewar had been at war, or if we were in turbulent times, cultural things didn't quite take a back seat as much that they could have under those given circumstances. Progress was constantly being made, and I believe that that was possible because of this mantra, that the idea was never to just go through things, and always the growth of things did matter. So that is where I connect what Dipti has been saying in a very structured and in a very cohesive manner. But this, from the outside perspective, is what I also feel. The other thing has always been that people from this part of the land have been hungry to do the right thing. But at the same time, there has never been an intent to go out there which has ever got mixed by wanting to prove, which again collaborates with my original point about growth, because everybody in this particular process or in this particular path, there has always been a sense of wanting to prove that we've been doing the right thing, or have we been doing the right thing, or and all those questions that come out, which are pretty legit. But the one thing that we concentrated on amongst ourselves was not to prove, but to keep improving. So we added the I am in front of the proving. So whenever we were in self-doubt, whenever we were in situations where we found ourselves that we could do things differently, always gave a scope of improvement. So, and that's where it allowed people to think, people to brainstorm, people to discuss. And that's where certain decisions and certain things and steps were being, were able to be taken. Be it building structures, moving capitals, picking the battles or the wars where sometimes where we didn't have a choice, where we had to defend ourselves. There have been so many such things that have been there, which are testimony today in the 21st century, which people can experience, people can visit. And I think that over the last 70 years of independent India has given us greatest joy is to be able to share our homes, to welcome people, to be able to tell them what life has been evolving and the way it has been evolving over the last 1500 years. A word that people constantly keep using, and it does unnerve me a little bit at times, is the word called story. You know, these are not our stories. These are somebody's reality. These are somebody's facts that people have given life for, people have dedicated their life for. So, you know, these are facts of life of people, and not just stories that could be, these are not created stories. These have been situations where people have actually lived, breathed, and in flesh and blood have lived them, breathed them, and created them. So I think in terms of just not looking at it as an intangible fabric, I think it's important to be able to come and envelope yourself in its true sense, and look at it as somebody's reality versus somebody's story. This is my understanding in terms of your question, and in terms of how does one take forward this responsibility. I think that the major thing in this is to be true to spirit. You know, you've got to kind of keep your head above your shoulders, keep a focused eye. The idea is to always constantly keep discussing, brainstorming, talking to the right sort of people, to be able to get, never be an impediment during that growth that is going to be there, which is going to be coming in the future, that allows you to make that progress, allows you to contribute in a healthy manner. The footprints that people have left behind, I think, are the ones that need to be taken forward in a more relevant manner in the 21st century. By just copy pasting things of the past today are not things that are going to cut it anymore. I think innovation is exceptionally important with the relevance of the 21st century.
As beautiful as these buildings are, they need to be maintained, they need to be managed in a good way in order to survive, and in order to help the family also survive. So I'd like to ask Mohan to talk about his experience as a manager of such an important historic site and monument. And this was actually one of the first historic houses and palaces that has been converted into a hotel. How is it different then from now? What have you learned in this journey, and now being given such an important and famous hotel? I'd love to hear what you have to say, Mohan.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, for inviting me on this lecture series.
If you could share your presentation, please, Mohan.
Yes, I will. And a very good morning and good evening and to everybody on the call. And I will begin with a few slides, and then I'll respond to some of these aspects that Dr. Schmidt has mentioned. If I might seek your indulgence, and while I share this presentation, I've switched my camera off to conserve bandwidth, and let's see how we go. So as you said, this is one of the oldest living palaces in the world, being operated as a palace hotel. Some viewers might know this photograph. This is a famous print from Colin Murray in 1872-73, simply titled Palace on the Lake. And my second photograph, actually, you've seen earlier in Dipti's presentation. This is much later, from 1950. But interestingly, now you will start to see the changes from what it was originally built like and what today by the various additions that have been done at different points in time. So very quickly, built by Maharana Jagat Singh and II, and it was used only by the members of the Mewar royal family and their nobility. During the reign of Maharana Bhupal Singh, which was 1930 to 55, he shifted his secretariat, the Mekhma caste, to Jagnivas. And then during the reign of Maharana Bhagwat Singh, it was converted into a hotel in February 1963 and subsequently given to the Taj Group in 1971. This is a very, very early advertisement, if you will, from 1965, just a couple of years after it became a hotel, which was put out then by the Maharana. And over time, as one would imagine, it has hosted a significant number of what we might call VIPs, British political agents, then His Highness of Bikaner, Maharaja Ratan Singh, Viceroys, Lord Elgin, Lord Minto, and later in the post-independence era, amongst others, our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was a visitor here in 1948. Jacqueline Kennedy, the wife of the then President of the United States, John Kennedy, was here in 1962. So really you will see kind of a famous residence continuing to be in operation. Here I've tried to put together a set of images that show you some pictures of what some of these, for lack of a better word, apartments in Jagnivas used to be and what they look like today. While these have been very sensitively adapted as spaces by Taj over the years, the spaces are no longer the same, and such images provide rare glimpses of the original interiors of the Jagnivas' apartments and suites. And various Maharanas have added to Jagnivas over a period of time. Maharana Swarup Singh expanded the bastion in 1851. Shambhu Singh Ji added what's today the suite Shambhu Niwas. Sajjan Singh later, Maharana Fateh Singh, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the earliest suites in the palace, dating from the original structure, the Kush Mahal. That's a quick glimpse of what it looks like today. Another one from Maharana Shambhu Singh's time in 1867, the Sarvaritu suite. What it looks like today gives you a good flavor of how lovingly the interiors have been restored and are maintained today. This is from Maharana Sajjan Singh's time. He built this in 79-81. This is what it looks like today. And I'm going to come back to this image a little later in the presentation to make a point on technology. This is Maharana Bhupal Singh from 1925, the Chandra Prakash suite, and what it looks like today. Moving right along, this is another significant part of that heritage and history of Jagnivas and Lake Palace that we manage today. This is an image of the Ghandor Boat, the royal wooden barge, which is now over 160 years old. The Maharanas would be seated as per tradition on this wooden barge to observe the festivities along the length of the lake shore during the Ghandor festival. There were initially two such boats, both wooden, not operated by any electrical or mechanical means, just simply hand oared. Over time, they fell into disrepair, and when the Octopussy movie was filmed here in the mid-1980s, the Octopussy team was very keen to use this in the film. And so they salvaged one and restored the other into working condition again, and that's what we use today to create some incredible experiences for our guests. So in a sense, the legacy is today utilized to create larger than life experiences. We've used this to host private dinners, young couples to propose to each other, and so on and so forth. But what really, I think, overlays it from an operator's perspective is the warmth and the finesse that the service team brings into this. And there, I think IHCL, the parent company of Taj, is particularly fortunate, because we have this portfolio of these original family palaces directly linked to royalty. The collection today spans 9 such palaces. And that, I think, helps us to interrelate one to the other and also link it back to our flagship hotel, the Taj Mahal Palace in Mumbai, 1903, which opened. The Chamber of Princes from the 1930s till independence used to meet at that hotel in Bombay. And so many of these princely kings, rulers, whatever you choose to call them, met in that hotel. So in that sense, the connection of Taj is not a modern day connection. It's something that stretches back close to 70, 80 years now. Another important thing that helps us to overlay that level of service on this beautiful product is the people, because we have within our teams, we are again fortunate or blessed, if you will, to have a bunch of people who are today serving the guests for the second or the third, or in one case, the chef on the extreme right is a fourth generation chef. There are instances where our colleagues in the workspace, their fathers, their grandfathers have worked in the royal households before and continue to work with us. So that from a guest experience perspective brings a legacy of, and I know Lakshyaraj dissed the word stories, but it brings together a bunch of experiences that probably nobody else can relate to when you go and stay at a typical hotel. Now the point on technology that I was making earlier, I'll make a quick reference here. From a housekeeping or a maintenance perspective, and I think Dr. Schmidt also alluded to this earlier, the job is immense. It's really a responsibility that you can't take lightly, because you've got these fantastic spaces that are close to 250 years old today that still need to be preserved and maintained. So it's not just a question of cleaning a room like in a normal hotel. It's a question of maintaining a part of the history of not just the country, but of the world, really. So this is where I think a lot of our time and effort goes in maintaining this to the standard where the guest has the comforts and conveniences of a modern day stay, but continues to also enjoy the heritage, for which is probably what he's coming to this in the first place. And if you remember that photo earlier of the Sajan Niwas suite, you might have noticed the two pankhas, the cloth fans on the ceiling, which in the old days would have been operated by people pulling it by stationing themselves outside the doors of the room while the Maharana stayed inside. Today, we have very discreetly inserted a mechanical motor. So it continues to operate that heritage fan without the requirement of having a person pulling on it. So the guests get the experience of what the Maharana would have felt way back in a nice way today. This image, I think, is flashed all over the world. In fact, you can't come and stay anywhere in Udaipur without running into Octopussy somewhere or the other. But that's really not the only film that's been filmed here. Much earlier to Octopussy, in fact, even before the palace became a hotel, 1959, there was a German film, Der Tiger von Eshnapur, that was filmed here. Later on, 1960, again before it was a hotel, some famous Hindi films, Mera Saya, Guide, set extensively within Udaipur city, the city palace and the lake palace. And of course, in 1984, The Jewel in the Crown, the BBC series, was shot extensively here. So these have also been utilized today to create some memorable experiences. For example, we have a whole line of Bond cocktails that our guests can savor today, because in the books of Fleming, while we've all from the movies known James Bond for martini shaken not stirred, in the books he actually drinks much more than a vodka martini. So we've gone back to each of those books and found out what he drank in each book and recreated cocktails. So these are the kind of things that I think help to position the palace at a level where the travelers really want to come and experience. Again, this is a shot of, so Dipti had this picture earlier of the Maharana boating in the lake in the front. So this is that particular space that you saw on that painting, which today is enclosed and converted to become our all-day diner, the Jharokha. The point I'm making is this marble there is from 1746. So for someone with a keen eye staying in the palace, and someone who stays a couple of days at least, would be able to spot this wonderful juxtaposition of what was original in the structure, what has been built and added later. And you can see the difference in marble. You can see the slight discoloration over time, but that adds that nice patina that gives you that wonderful feeling of actually staying in history as opposed to just staying in a hotel. Some of the traditions, this is that image of the Bardo Mahal that Dipti waxed so eloquent about, and I can't match her eloquence, but this still is a wonderful space. Today it's called the Lily Pond, and we do a variety of events here, private parties, musical serenades, again with this whole motif of recreating that legacy of royalty for our guests. Another image of that wonderful suite, the Sarva Ritu. Again, the point here is about maintenance, how it is not just a question of room cleaning, but a question of, in a sense, heritage preservation. Craftsmanship, something that perhaps we might take for granted in other places. I want to spend a few moments here on some of the particular challenges of managing an island palace in the middle of a lake. And again, a lot of these swings, the artifacts, are all well over 100, 150 years old. This, many of our viewers might recognize, this is the famous chikri work, a kind of mirror mosaic work, very, very popular in this region, and also utilized in other structures around in other parts of the country. The Sheesh Mahal of Shah Jahan from 1631 has an extensive use of this tikri work. The name in the Mewari tikri refers to shards of a broken pot. It's a very time-consuming art form which uses these pieces, bits and pieces of mirrors to create this wonderful mosaic and imagery on the walls. The challenge today is to find that level of skilled artisan who can continue to work. And again, we are very lucky because of this connection with the family. We are able to use craftsmen who are today again in their third and fourth generation, where their forefathers have been involved in the palace in such kinds of restoration work. But this is time consuming, and in terms of upkeep, it's a constant challenge. Another area that takes up a lot of management time and effort is moving equipment in. Like I said, today, you're sitting in this palace, but you're continuing to enjoy electricity, you're continuing to enjoy internet. So everything, the internet, sewage, water, all of this goes underwater, and moving equipment in and out is a challenge. So this is a picture from a few years ago when we had to change one of our air conditioning chillers. And we had to bring in this massive 5,000 kilogram Daikin 200-ton chiller into the property. And you can see, so it comes up the shoreline, is offloaded onto a floating pontoon by a crane, is then floated across the lake, where we have a second pontoon with a crane hoisting this over the top of the building into the center, and then create these rails to drag this into a plant room and then connect the whole thing. And by the same way, the old one, which was in this case a Voltus 180-ton chiller with expiring refrigerant, had to be taken out. This entire exercise took us close to 14 days. And mind you, this is a running hotel. So these are the kind of challenges that make my life interesting on a day-to-day basis. This is a photograph of that underwater cable. As I mentioned, water, internet, sewage, everything is underwater. We need to be constantly checking this to make sure that there are no leaks, there are no breakages. So again, today technology is available. One can do pressure tests and dye tests. But again, if you're not very regular and diligent with this, you could have a problem very quickly. So Dr. Schmidt wanted me to also make a quick reference to today's times with the pandemic and what is happening in the business of luxury hospitality. And all I can say is that these are certainly the most trying times for the hospitality industry as a whole. But I'm hopeful because of our, as human beings, I think we're social animals, and our innate desire to connect, to meet, to converse, to travel and explore, that's not going to change. That's not going to perish. And very definitely travel will continue. And I think in that context, small palaces like ours, these heritage structures are ideal because all over you've got these lovely chhatris, you've got these isolated terraces, you've got these very private spaces where without wanting to also, you're physically distant. So what can be safer than coming to a Taj Lake Palace and having to avoid the crowds that you might see in a typical hotel, but to sit here and to enjoy a meal, looking out on a full lake. I mean, Dr. Schmidt also used the word romantic. This certainly has to be one of the most romantic palace hotels of the world. In that sense, I think we are really, really fortunate that we get to manage this property. And this legacy continues. Very recently, a few months ago on the 1st of Jan, we have also acquired a management lease for the Taj Fateh Prakash Palace, another palace of the royal family built from 1910, a much later palace, so much later style of architecture, very different kinds of rooms. But again, like with the Lake Palace, not built to be a hotel. So no two rooms are alike. Each room is unique. There are no long corridors with rooms opening on either side. So the tradition, the legacy that I mentioned, these 9 historic palaces that we own and operate continues. And this, I think, is what makes Taj so special. And I also want to quickly wind up by referring to to something that we're doing today to boost travel. If you go onto our website, www.tajhotels.com/Udaipur, you will see for the first time an all-inclusive bunch of packages loaded there. So a guest coming in today is able to book himself on an accommodation package, which includes all his meals, all his taxes, really taking that hassle away from travel, because that we believe is something that we need to do to keep interest in travel alive. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to share, and I'll switch off here.
Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating presentation. Really wonderful. And I think hats off to the Taj Group. I mean, the dedication to the property, the knowledge that you display. I mean, I didn't expect this. I thought you knew about hospitality and so on, but I mean, everything you know about the property and everything you do to revive it and so on is so sensitively done. It's really at the first class and really fantastic. I mean, it's wonderful. Thank you. I would like to ask Diederik to finish the presentation by talking about something important that we might not at the first instance see when we look at this wonderful property and wonderful hotel, namely the very intimate connection between water and heritage that is so important for us today. The importance of water, water shortage, and of course sewage treatment, pollution, everything we are dealing with. And when you gave a presentation a few years ago in Delhi, I was so inspired by what you did. I felt, especially living in India, I felt I had to do this. I had to take it up. And I want to thank, ICOMOS for all the support and you've given at the Center for Historic Houses also in the past. And please, I'm asking you to present.
Thank you so much, Mimi, to have me here. Thank you to share all this very beautiful heritage. Maybe I tell a little bit about my voyage through the water and heritage issues. 9 years ago, I became president of ICOMOS Netherlands, and I'm a conservation architect, and a lot of my friends are really caring about heritage. But I noticed that we are all keeping it up and are very afraid that this will fall in pieces. And heritage is not only meant having beautiful old stones, but it is also the wisdom and much deeper rooted sense of cultural DNA. So we were considering, well, what is happening with heritage? People doesn't seem to be connected with the past anymore. And I noticed that maybe the oil dependence nowadays of around 50 years ago, people didn't care anymore about living with nature because we could make life like like it comforts us. So when it's too hot, you put on the airco. When it's too cold, you put on the heater. And we start flying and transporting and have a lot of internet. So when you see the growth of the immense stick up with us, privileged people, dealing with this beautiful blue planet. But the way we are doing it, it is incredible sad. So a friend of me got the project Drinkable Rivers, Lianpo, and I'm very impressed because it is so simple. Why can't we drink the river anymore? So it starts with respect for nature. And when these palaces were built, they were orientated to worship the sun and to have ceremonies for the water. So that religious respect is still in a lot of our books worldwide. But we don't really act to have that inner respect anymore, to live with the nature. And now we face a lot of problems related to water. And I wanted to make bridges between the heritage part, going back to the root for a sustainable future. And we do it through the water issues. And well, this is quite a challenge, because even in the heritage world, we are living in silos, and it's very difficult sometimes to work together. And the water world is organized in the same way. We are nowadays, everybody is a specialist, but we lost the big picture. And we tried with this program to have a holistic view of the world, that everybody is connected and is one. So we started this program around 9 years ago with a seminar in Amsterdam. And we said, okay, let's invite the most important heritage people and the most important water people. And they, well, I never did something like that before, but it worked out, and it was a whole week with a lot of excursions. And the interesting thing, when you do something like this, it starts with sending, but when you're 3 or 4 or more days together, the interaction is much better. And we are still privileged to work all around the world with this beautiful program. One of the results of this first conference was a little, we call it trailer. So just to face our water problems worldwide. And maybe somebody can start the film we made.
Archit, if you could play this, please.
So it is not really focused on this beautiful Indian palaces, but it is a bigger picture. Although I was privileged to visit this.
This is the ICOMOS one?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, on it.
Let's see what happens.
Oh, can everyone see it?
Yes, just go to
1 second.
to the whole screen. Yes, full screen. Yeah, great, thank you. And we need to hear something as well. You need to enable audio.
Oh, it is enabled, ma'am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not the movie.
Oh, just 1 second. Can you hear it now?
Not yet.
No. IT, can IT help with this quickly? Why can we not hear this?
No, if the techniques are still, I hope it will work out, so I can tell a little bit more beside, otherwise everybody will fall asleep.
Someone in the chat is just giving some advice. Right corner, the audio button in the video itself.
The audio is on from my side, and I can hear it really
In the
well.
video itself. Yes, we did this. Yes, go up with this maybe.
Oh, which one?
What happens if you click on the audio button in the video on the right? You did that. Only this.
Yes, ma'am. It's working. Oh, can you hear it now?
No.
Okay, I'll just, what I'll do is, so there's the issue is, I'm on call from the laptop and it won't recognize laptop's voice. So I'll start the video on a different device, and then you can see the video here, and the voice will also come.
Okay, in the meantime, because today it's a little bit longer than usual because of the speakers, in the meantime, I'd like to invite the audience to ask some questions because we've covered so much fascinating material. So, right. I'm just going to the chat to see whether there are questions. There were a few, let me look. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask Dipti, you mentioned the word connoisseur. So I wonder what Hindi word you translated, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the idea of connoisseurship. And then I wanted to ask you about the black water. How do you explain that the water was black in the lily pool? Yeah, Dipti.
I'll take the second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll take the second question first. I think you're referring to the paintings. The water is not black. That's the oxidization that happens of the tin that is used to prepare the effect of silver. So that's a very common occurrence in most Indian paintings. Nonetheless, you know, the screen really doesn't do justice to these paintings. And in fact, one of the most exciting painting depicting lake palaces, which is the other lake palace, Jagmandir Lake Palace, is a large painting that's in the City Palace Museum at Udaipur, and has been now beautifully conserved by the conservation team over there, which has been at work on conserving these paintings for the last 2 years. And I want to give a shout out to all of them, all 5 of my brilliant colleagues over there. And in the way they have conserved the paintings, when you look at them closely, especially when they take the trouble to show it to me under raking light, you can actually see the way in which, even with the oxidization, how the painters try to capture these calm waves of a lake versus what you would think of as ripples in a river. And that's something that's really captured beautifully, and it's revealed only as conservators do the work to bring that out. And I'll, you know, that actually takes me to 2 points, both to the connoisseur, you know, connoisseurs who were trained to look at these details. So the word for connoisseurs actually goes to the basics of Indian aesthetic theory and the basics of pleasure, the concept of pleasure. So the word is rasika, that is the person who could taste the essence and the ultimate juice and the spirit of any art. And this particular aesthetic theory, which was about feeling with your entire corporeal self to realize the mood of artworks, and then to get to the ultimate experience, the rasa, the juice, if you will, in terms of its direct, exact translation, is something that was laid out in the 3rd, 4th century in various aesthetic texts, but in the Kama Sutra as well, which everybody thinks of as a text about sex in the body, but it's really a text about the question of desire and pleasure and delight and connoisseurship, and the training of the connoisseur to sense all of the 64 art forms that are connected. And we may think of this as a deep history that is timeless, but actually it's very well historicized in every different time period. So in a way, when you look at the Jagvilas, when you look at the making of the Jagnivas and the way the arts come together in it, you look at the paintings, each one of them is an iteration in its time of very astute patrons, their communities who are connoisseurs, their poets, their painters, their architects, realizing the vision of the Rasika and the arts in their time period in a way like what Lakshyaraj was saying. That is where the innovation happens, where there is a deep continuity, but it is, the art is made to do some work in its very specific time period. And the Jagnivas was a part of doing that work, of bringing this community together in the middle of the lake at a very critical time in Udaipur. And I have the last thing to say with regards to connoisseurship and the paintings and the conservation today, with regards to an exhibition that we are all working on at the City Palace Museum and at the National Museum of Asian Art in DC. But I hope you can give me 2 minutes in the end to talk a little bit about that, because none of this work would be possible without all of those partners and scholars and conservators and curators and the patrons of these institutions.
So I think we are not able to get the volume.
The audio should work now. Can we just test?
Okay, yeah, let's test.
Okay.
There is no denying global warming reached our shores. It is here to stay. Its impact felt the world over. Tidal waves rip the coast apart. Bulging water takes over our cities, changing our lives, changing our livelihoods, destroying what we hold dear, what we cherish, what we believe in. Our gods, our temples, our heritage, all washed away forever. What a great achievement. Global population grew from 1 to 7 billion and counting. Every day the number grows. And while cities expand, even greater numbers flock the streets. However, almost half of us live in coastal areas, in river deltas, on the shore, and some below the sea. And still the water is rising. It is striking, actually, how nature is replaced by harbors. Big ships where birds used to roam. Inner cities getting clogged up and offices built on historical grounds. Concrete forcing the water upwards, not letting it seep into the ground, and taking away the landmarks that generations knew. Still, our ways of dealing with water are similar the world over. Fighting it, fleeing from it, and freezing it in concrete and sand. Because in our perpetual fight against the water, we humans invent new ways to face new challenges, and our genius takes over. However, history tells us that moving sand is not enough to protect us, that we should work not against the water, but with it. Because by understanding the water, we all benefit using the river, irrigating the land and protecting it against floods. In Dujiang, the system works 2,000 years and continuing today. And isn't this spectacular? Harnessing the water since Darius the Great, feeding the city and the land. The operating system, 5 centuries BC. Heritage is still used in Europe as well. Steam engines pump water since 100 years, providing capacity when situations require. Also, ecological farming is nothing new. A complex system of canals and terraces, rice, buffalo, cattle and fish, since 1,000 years, all combined. Maintenance is key to keep water heritage working, and when done properly, it will stay for centuries and inspire generations to come. Still, danger is lurking in the canals. When old systems are not maintained, neglected or ignored, we all suffer badly. Since ancient times, water feeds people's lives, their rituals and religions, important for humans all over the world, each and every one in their own way. Practical things are settled by ritual as well, like water disputes in Spain. The court gathers since the times of Al-Andalus, settling disputes in public, bringing peace to the people. Protected by the temples and overseen by the gods, water is sacred, and sometimes it shows, like the river feeding into Angkor Wat. Shiva's linga fecundates the water and the land, thus providing food for 100 villages or more. Water forgives, consoles, and gives hope. So let's learn from the past, because the solutions are there and in the present, combining them like yin and yang. Living on the water is what we do, in different ways, in different cultures, and in different styles. Whether we live above the water or below it, or reclaim it, we have to live with it. We can learn from each other to do so, how to manage water well, how to use heritage, and how to use the knowledge of ancient times. Saving the world's deltas is critical for the future of us, our children, and generations to come. The number of disasters increases, and so does their intensity. Civilizations are at risk, and fast urbanization of delta areas, without respecting historical water structures, makes them even more vulnerable. But heritage helps by providing valuable examples and successful strategies to deal with uncertainty and risk. Centuries-old knowledge is the key of living with water and water structures passed on over generations. These will offer solutions for the future. We believe that harmony between water and heritage management will improve spatial quality and contribute to the preservation of civilizations, and ultimately to the well-being of mankind.
Thank you. Wonderful. I would also like to say that next week we'll have the royal family of Capotala talking also about the great collection of French decorative arts and the fascination with French architecture. So please join us also next Friday. And maybe Dipti, you wanted to say something again about the exhibition. Of course, we are all ears for this. Thank you.
Sorry. I appreciate you giving me another opportunity, especially after that film was shown stressing the question of water and water resources, and keeping that in mind as we enter into these landscapes today and think about their historicity as well as their contemporary challenges and relevance and questions of continuity and preservation. Because I think these are at the core of how the City Palace Museum and the foundation there has been operating with architecture and urban environment conservation under Dr. Shikhar Jain for the past 20 years. Also, you know, there's an exhibition that's been in the works for the last now almost a decade, which is a partnership between the City Palace Museum, Udaipur, and the National Museum of Asian Art of the Smithsonian Institution, which will be opening in towards the end of 2022 and going into 2023, which looks at this important painting tradition from Udaipur, which takes its land and its lakes and its forests and its hills as its subject of inquiry. And in trying to understand this entire work, there, of course, this is some research that I've been doing for many, many years now, but it's really been coming to fruition in this exhibition, which brings together the question of experience, both historically, but also in the present, into focus. And that's where, kind of questioning what we usually think of or not as the existence of the genre of landscape within South Asian art, but also as my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Deborah Diamond and her team has been doing, is to really understand the question of water and water resources that are depicted in many of these landscapes, and studying all of the various types that are depicted in each one of them to almost collate a catalog, which takes you into questions of aesthetics, mapping, management, ecology, and how they come together in these imaginations and creations of artists and poets in the 18th and 19th century. In fact, my book that is coming and the exhibition begins with, which might be of interest to many people here, begins with a very vernacular account from the late 17th century going into the first 20 years of the 18th century, which is a year-by-year account of rains and droughts and price changes and agrarian changes, and how that affects all of Rajasthan and Gujarat. And in a way, how that changes how we look at paintings that are being made, which are of these monumental monsoons and these lakes, and as Dr. Diamond has found, in certain cases of landscapes that don't seem to be flourishing and perhaps signal towards a dry season. And why was that of importance for artists to depict that in paintings that were all about kingly praise in a way? So I just wanted to give a shout out that, you know, what has been featured over here is the work of a large team of experts who've been making this possible, and there's a lot more to come. So I hope you keep your eyes and ears peeled for that.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm sure the Taj Hotel will get the 2 books of yours on the Lake Palace for the library at the hotel. Great. So thank you very much for your for your wonderful presentations. I think it was really brilliant. And you know, we hope to continue from here. We hope to collaborate and do exciting projects, smaller and bigger, national and international, with all of you. Please get in touch with the Center for Historic Houses. If you have a wonderful property that you'd like to talk about, please get in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.
So much.
Good night.